Hello and a very warm welcome on this slightly grey afternoon, wherever you are, online or live here. It is my pleasure to welcome Siddharth Varadarajan to this online event about press freedom and the many challenges that journalists face today in the India of Narendra Modi. It is a special pleasure to actually have you here in Berlin. It is a rare occurrence in these times, and we're very glad that you can join us wherever you are. India is often referred to as the world's largest democracy. It might be a cliche, but it is also treated as such on the political playing field. The acting German Foreign Minister, Heiko Maas, has been keen to emphasize the value of the strategic partnership between two states with shared democratic values. In RSF's 2021 World Press Freedom Index, however, India ranks 142nd out of a total of 180 states. Recently, the Indian government's alleged use of the Pegasus spyware has made headlines, but in addition to state surveillance, media professionals face police violence, they face attacks by members of radical political and religious groups, and threats and reprisals by corrupt politicians endanger the work of local reporters in particular. In 2021 alone, 4 journalists have been murdered. The latest freelance reporter, Budinath Jha, was found dead only a few days ago after he went missing while investigating illegal clinics. Another young man died in October whilst covering farmers' protests in Uttar Pradesh. His family alleges, once again, police violence. Legal harassment has become a weapon of choice for local authorities and high-ranking national politicians suing critical media representatives into silence and bogging them down in unnecessary meetings and time spent in court instead of reporting on local issues. Radical supporters of the government form troll armies on social media, targeting especially women journalists. And in 2021, India also reached a historical low point, imposing the longest internet shutdown ever imposed in a democracy. For more than 1.5 years, the population of Jammu and Kashmir was denied access to the internet. So numerous challenges, some of which, not all of which likely we will cover today, and it's my pleasure to introduce Siddharth once again. He's the founding editor of The Wire. He's a studied economist, holding degrees from the London School of Economics as well as Columbia University. He joined The Hindu in 2004 and became its editor in 2011. In 2015, he co-founded the independent news platform The Wire, which he currently runs as editor-in-chief. He's the recipient of numerous journalism awards, including the Shorenstein Journalism Award and the Ramnath Goenka Award for Journalist of the Year. He taught economics at NYU, New York University, and journalism at the University of California, besides working at the Times of India. Thank you very much for joining us today.
Pleasure.
Now, as I just mentioned, you've been a political editor, you've been a journalist in India for much longer than the current presidency of Narendra Modi. Can you give us a sort of big picture to enter into this conversation about the challenges that you faced back in the early 2000s and what has changed since then?
Yeah. So I think press freedom in India is constitutionally guaranteed, not in an explicit sense, but is there through freedom of speech, freedom of expression, and the courts in India, particularly the Supreme Court, has over the decades upheld freedom of the press to be one of those fundamental rights and freedoms of people in India. And throughout the last 70, 75 odd years, media freedom has come under strains and pressures, and these are not unusual for a democratic country because people in power have different levers which they can use to exert influence, pressure, intimidation to varying degrees of success. And India, like many other democratic countries, has had its fair share of these problems. So yes, there is a free press guaranteed by law, but this freedom has to be fought for and preserved every inch of the way. And what we've seen over the last 7 years, since Narendra Modi became Prime Minister, is a qualitative and quantitative escalation of attacks on media freedom. It's become much more difficult today than arguably at any time in the last 7 decades to work as an independent media organization. Journalists are much more at risk today than they have been in the past for carrying out the work that everybody expects a journalist to do, which is to go out in the field, cover stories, cover conflicts, cover violence. It's become much more of an occupational hazard today than we've seen in the past, and I think that this is a reality that we are reminded of virtually every week when a new incident of harassment or intimidation emerges from one corner of India or the other. So yeah, freedom of the press, this may seem oxymoronic in the world's largest democracy, but freedom of the press in India today is under severe strain. And it does call into question the government's commitment to democratic values when something so basic as free and independent reporting is not tolerated by authority, by government in the way that it should be in any democratic country.
Certainly. Can you pinpoint specific points in time over the last 5 years or more where you really felt a threshold was passed, where the government specifically, through speeches, through specific actions, through specific court cases, crossed the border?
So the traditional form of harassment of media in India has been the filing of defamation cases. India has both civil and criminal defamation, which is unusual for a democracy. Most democratic countries have done away with the concept of criminal defamation. India still has that. And criminal defamation is frequently resorted to by people in power or powerful interests in society against journalists, against media houses. And we saw the use of defamation carry on, of course, under Mr. Modi's regime, where either politicians or business persons affiliated to or close to the government use defamation as a tactic to silence media critics. But that's the kind of harassment that, in a way, one had got used to. It's kind of part of the terrain, as it were. Nothing unusual about that. Similarly, the use of government advertising as a lever. Now, this is advertising that's paid for by public funds. So there ought not to be any discrimination on the basis of political preferences of the ruling party. But we've seen in different states of India and at the national level, government advertising being used as a lever of pressure. So newspapers that are critical of government, both at the state and at the federal level, have tended to be cut off from public advertising. And those who support the government get favored with it. So the use of advertising, public advertising as a lever is something which existed in the past and carries on today. But what's new in terms of the media terrain, and this has come into sharp relief over the last 2 years, I would say, is the increasing resort to filing criminal cases for news reports. So a journalist who goes out into the field to cover an incident of violence in which, say, Muslims have been targeted or Dalits have been targeted, precisely because these incidents show the government concerned in bad light. The new trend has been to file criminal charges against that reporter or against media houses for carrying stories which are in some way embarrassing to the government. This is new. The Wire itself and its staff have been subjected to 4 or 5 these kind of criminal cases over the past year and a half. But this is happening across the board to reporters and media houses. During the pandemic, it's quite funny, really, if you think about it. But there was a reporter in the Andamans, which is in Indian Union Territory in the Indian Ocean, and in the Bay of Bengal, actually. And so there was this young reporter who tweeted about how the local police had quarantined a family simply because they had spoken on the telephone to somebody who had COVID. And this irked the local police, and they went and filed, fairly serious criminal charges against this reporter. And it took him a whole year before he could get a high court to quash those charges. So that's at the ludicrous end of the spectrum, right? But most recently, we have the case of two young women reporters who traveled to the eastern state of Tripura to cover anti-Muslim violence that had happened there. And one of the organizations that is accused of being involved in the anti-Muslim violence went and filed a criminal case with the local police, accusing these two women reporters of instigating trouble and all kinds of very far-fetched charges. And the police accepted this complaint and then moved to arrest these two women reporters. Really quite shocking. So as I said, every week examples are emerging from different parts of India of the willingness of the police and local politicians to use criminal law as a form of intimidation. And this is something which is really very, very harmful because it has the, it has the obvious chilling effect, right? If there's trouble or violence that has occurred somewhere, editors will think twice before they send reporters. Reporters will think 100 times before they file a story. They may feel that their very presence in this kind of an area may serve as an excuse for the police to harass them or to even arrest them. So this is deeply troubling.
And what I understand, we briefly talked about this earlier, it's very common for states obviously to have defamation laws in place. The question is, how are they applied, how are they used? What is quite common, as I understand, is that third parties who are not really involved in the case in any way may charge reporters.
Not so much with defamation, although that happens too, but for criminal cases. One of the cases against The Wire, for example, stems from some random guy taking offense at a story or a tweet that we put out, and then going into a police station and claiming that our tweet or our story has the potential to trigger insurrection against the government. So it's a very grave and serious charge, which has no factual basis at all, and without even bothering to ascertain the facts or to see whether there is any logic to this complaint, the police will go ahead and register the complaint, and the assumption is that these random individuals are actually not random. They are people with political connections, people whom the police reckon it's worth their while to humor. And these cases get registered. We know from practice that when they eventually go to court, nothing will come of them. But they have the effect of subjecting reporters to endless harassment. Within 2 weeks of the lockdown being announced last year, I had a posse of about 12 policemen visit my home in Delhi in order to summon me to appear at a police station about 1,000 miles away for a tweet that I put out because somebody had complained. So this kind of intimidation and harassment is something new. And you're right. I mean, either an aggrieved person or the police themselves ought to file criminal cases. But in India, people connected to the ruling party have made it somewhat of a fashion now to go running to the police station to file a complaint whenever they see or hear something in the media that they don't like. So the target may be a journalist or an editor. The target could be a comedian. The target could be an artist. The target could be a filmmaker. So the assault is actually not just on media freedom, but I would say on freedom of speech and freedom of expression in general. And the willingness of the police to indulge these kinds of petty intolerances is what has made the terrain so hazardous today.
How successful do you think this strategy is? You spoke about the chilling effect, you spoke about, obviously, yourself and your team being bogged down in unnecessary legal meetings.
Yeah.
covering fees, I guess financial strains as well.
Yeah.
But largely it's about sort of distracting.
Yeah.
Distracting teams as well.
Yeah.
So how does this affect your day-to-day work? How successful is it?
Yeah, no, that's a good question. I think it varies from target to target. In the case of The Wire, I would say that they obviously haven't been successful in deterring us from our core work, which is to do independent journalism in the public interest. But yes, they do manage to waste our time. They do manage to waste our meager resources in these legal battles. But it hasn't really affected the quality of the work we do. I would say that the chilling effect is more noticeable when they go after freelance reporters who don't necessarily have institutional backing of any kind, who don't have an organization that can take care of the legal challenges. I think the problem is very acute in a place like Jammu Kashmir, where reporters are frequently summoned to the police station to render account for stories that they have filed, which may be factually completely correct, but which the police obviously don't like. So they would then use this tactic of summoning a reporter to the police station and as a form of intimidation, as a form of harassment. Somewhere down the line, you have to imagine that this tactic takes its toll on individual reporters who then, every human being is risk averse beyond a point, right? So you then weigh the costs and benefits of doing a particular story. And I think that's the aim behind this kind of harassment, that you raise the costs or you raise the potential costs for journalists to do their work in the hope that many of them will be deterred. And I think that this is really the method and the madness. I should also add that there is a disturbing tendency now to throw the book, as it were, to file cases against people on social media. So you could have a story put out by somebody, by, say, a media organization, and the criminal case filed would be not just against the media outfit concerned, but may also involve dozens of people who shared the story on social media or who liked it. So this, I believe, is an attempt to dissuade people on social media from reading, sharing, liking content which the state doesn't like. So you have very calculated use of criminal law as a means of ensuring certain stories don't get reported, and if they do, ensuring that they don't get read or shared, and hence not disseminated widely. So I think that this is a new and dangerous turn that the assault on media freedom in India has taken over the last 7 years in general, but particularly over the last 2 years.
And to what extent do you feel there is still room for a public discourse about this very strategy, this media strategy of the government?
Well, I mean, Indian social media platforms are full of discussion and comment on this. And the irony is that whenever we have conversations like this, where we speak about the threat to free speech or media freedom in India, you will have any number of people say, well, you aren't arrested. You are having this conversation. So the fact is that, yeah, there's plenty of discussion and debate on social media, but the fact is that the police and powerful politicians do not think twice about the social media reaction when they take a decision to curb expression or to curb, to crack down on certain kind of reporting. During the farmers' protest in January, for example, a farmer died in what the police claimed was an accident, and which farmers themselves claimed was some kind of bullet injury. They said he was shot, by whom we don't know. A number of senior reporters tweeted the fact that this farmer had been shot dead. And the response of the police was to file, of the Delhi police, which is considered one of the more professional police forces in the country. Their response was to file not just any old kind of criminal case, but they accused senior journalists in India, including Mrinal Pandey, who was India's first woman editor of a newspaper, of a national newspaper. They accused her and others of sedition. In other words, of conspiring to overthrow the government, simply for having tweeted about the allegation that a farmer had been shot dead by the police. Right? So that move was so outrageous and so patently false. But the police went ahead and filed those cases. And even though the Supreme Court has stayed action on it, there's no sign that the Delhi police intends to relent or to withdraw that obviously bogus charge.
I'm interested in this relationship between media and social media. Obviously, Twitter censorship has skyrocketed, as I understand, as we take from, for example, Twitter's transparency reports. The Indian government has increased the pressure on global or American originating platforms to locally take down content. To what extent does this affect your work? To what extent does it infect the extent to which you can reach out to people? Is it an Indian problem in itself, as in that it shapes the Indian discourse, or is it much more a matter of international access to Indian debates?
So I think Facebook and Twitter recognize that India is a huge market for them. And there are literally millions and millions and millions of users. And the fact is that these have, despite all the digital sort of inequalities in India, these two platforms have emerged as important spaces for public discussion. There's no question about that. And the government used Facebook and Twitter, I would say beautifully, for the past 7 years in order to get its message across. And the government supporters have been very adept at using, say, a platform like Twitter in order to promote certain points of views or to attack other points of view that are problematic for the government. And as long as the battle on Twitter was perceived by the government as going its way, the government was quite happy to allow Twitter to do whatever it wants and to they were confident that they could play Twitter in a way that would always work for the ruling party. What's happened over the last year or so is that Twitter, for reasons best known to itself, has felt compelled to also act in instances where the ruling party has put out fake news. And in one particular instance where Twitter labeled a tweet put out by a BJP spokesperson, Twitter put the label "manipulated media" on a particular document, and that caused the government to really go over the top in targeting Twitter and saying that this is a foreign company that's out to subvert India. And since then, there's been a kind of to and fro and an increasing attempt by the government to control and regulate social media in some way. They've come up with new rules as well now, which we can talk about. But I would say Twitter is still, and Twitter in some ways overcompensated after that run-in with the government by banning a number of Twitter handles. In one case, they temporarily blocked the handle of Caravan, which is a respectable and leading magazine in India. And they were, of course, forced to reverse that within 24 hours. But yeah, there's a certain lack of transparency in the way Twitter functions. And they need to be more transparent. But I would say that social media platforms have play a very useful role for media in India, particularly independent and small media like ours, because they help to level the playing field of distribution. Right? We get our word across in a much more cost-effective manner than we might in the absence of Twitter. But this is a contested space, and I expect the government to ramp up its pressure on Twitter and on Facebook to make sure that it becomes even more difficult for critical voices to be heard and to be amplified on social media. So This is one area where the government is trying to come up with rules and regulations. They've crafted what are called the information technology rules, which in a way allow, they provide for a so-called grievance redressal mechanism. So Twitter, and not just Twitter, by the way, all digital news organizations, including ours, we are now compelled by law to have a grievance redressal officer whose mandate is to receive and log so-called reader complaints and then address them. And we've challenged this rule in court because the way the rules are structured, a bureaucratic committee will have final say in what is acceptable journalism and what is not, and we believe this is unconstitutional. So we've challenged this in court, but Twitter, for example, is now obliged by these rules to have a grievance redressal officer who must serve as a clearinghouse for readers who are upset about something or the other. And so the chances are that the more you create these kinds of rules, the government at least hopes that it would be easier for them to lean on Twitter to get content removed, which is not bad content or illegal content in any way, but which is just politically embarrassing for the government. So maybe you flood Twitter with hundreds and thousands of complaints and you compel Twitter to act. I don't know how this finally plays out, but yeah, this relationship between media and social media is one that we really need to watch.
It's interesting to see how this, in a very, very specific way, obviously echoes a global discourse of putting pressure on these platforms, on these big tech platforms to re-regulate it. And you've mentioned that it's obviously also a positive space. It's a space of dissent, essentially, that in its self-regulation can offer additional freedoms that are otherwise non-existent, but it can also turn into arbitrariness. How do you see this global discourse around big tech platforms informing the discourse, or is that something so totally separate from?
No, I think every country and every sort of public sphere, in a way, is debating and discussing this matter, right? In the US, for example, there are many people in the freedom of expression camp who are not very happy with the blanket ban, say, on a person like Donald Trump that Facebook and Twitter imposed. And they see this as intervention which clearly has a political impact. So these are things which countries and communities have to work out. I think in India the problem really is one of, and this has come out in some of the hearings that the Facebook whistleblower has been having in U.S. Congress, on Capitol Hill, where it emerges that Facebook has been rather overindulgent to hate speech promoted by people close to the ruling party in India. So we've seen instances where Facebook's own internal audit mechanisms suggest that certain pages should be either taken down or downplayed algorithmically. And Facebook India took a political decision not to do that because it didn't want to offend the ruling party, right? So we know that there is a problem. We know that Facebook is aware that there's a problem. And I think it's deeply, deeply problematic if Facebook's attitude towards, say, hate speech, if that's what we're talking about here, is going to be dictated to by some wider sense of business interest, right? So clearly, Facebook India and Facebook globally took a call that the Indian market is very huge and important for us. And in order to grow this market, we need the cooperation of the government of India. So we don't really want to do things which are going to offend the ruling party in India, even if the ruling party and its supporters are doing god-awful things, even if they are actively promoting hate, and hate particularly at a time when violence is being instigated, people are getting killed, property is being damaged. So it's deeply problematic if Facebook is unwilling to act. But the subtext or the secondary question is it, I mean, it's clearly not a great thing to have a company which is ultimately answerable only to its shareholders, enjoying this kind of enormous power to decide what content we see or don't see, right? So I think that in an ideal world, there ought to be some kind of a regulatory mechanism. But the problem that I see is the same as when we discuss, or whenever there's a discussion about the regulation of media. Let's set aside social media for a moment, right? Question is, can you trust politicians who clearly implement the law in ways that suit themselves to regulate media? And the answer is you can't. Because particularly in a country where institutional oversight is not very well developed, it would be suicidal to empower the government or some kind of an official entity to decide what content passes muster and what content doesn't. Because, as with hate speech laws in India, we see, India has some pretty strict laws against hate speech, but these laws tend to be used against those who protest government policy rather than those who are actually engaging in hate speech. And, so this is, I think, an issue that we ultimately, will not be able to resolve in any narrow sense unless there is a thorough deepening of democratic institutions and greater accountability of elected representatives to the electorate on a day-to-day basis, which we don't have.
Back in 2019, I believe it was, you gave a talk at the Reuters Institute at Oxford in which you covered the power and hope that you invest in the reader themselves.
Yes.
You said, and I quote, amidst the doom and gloom of political capture, of public life, the many challenges of media freedom in India, we must soldier on in the hope that the reader, viewer, citizen loves her democratic rights more than anything else and will recognize that unless the media is able to do its job independently, it will be good night and good luck for democracy too.
Yes.
So what is this relationship with the reader? How do you use that as a resource? How do you invest in the conversation with the readers themselves?
Yeah.
You, as the wire, as the medium, you've invested in, as part of a trailblazer group of media, in the Journalism Trust Initiative, launched by RSF, as a sort of constructive approach to increase transparency of editorial procedures, of financial ownership of media. How do you see that as a way forward in the whole general discourse of big tech, of reader engagement, of disinformation laws and regulation?
Yeah. We started The Wire in 2015 with the premise that the business model of media was in some ways broken, and that the more media was dependent on big investors who typically have weak knees, the larger, the bigger and richer they are, the less likely they are to take risks, the less likely they are to be willing to offend the government. So rather than being dependent, so media, we needed to end the dependence on investors, end the dependence on, or over-dependence on advertising, and come up with new forms of funding and financing for media. And while philanthropy, we felt, could play an important role at the startup stage, but over the long haul, it's only the reader or the viewer of media who can ensure through their regular subscriptions or donations that media remains on the sort of straight and narrow path, right? And the principle is very simple, that if readers and viewers are not willing to pay for media, then sitting, taking a back seat necessarily means that the funders and the financiers, who are typically investors, advertisers, and so on, they are the ones who are going to command the vehicle and decide how it's going to go. So readers and viewers need to step up. And we are in a happy position where we raise, in a good month, easily 70 to 80% of our operating costs from reader donations. And we think that this works well for us, and it will work well for others too, in other geographies. But this is only sustainable and possible if there is a relationship of trust. So the reader needs to recognize the fact or see value in the work that you're doing, right? And that value is reflected not just in stories that they like. So we may cover stories, we may run articles, or we may focus on themes that the big media avoids. And readers like that, and the readers want to support that. But equally importantly, they need to have full visibility on the overall functioning of the organization. They need to know what are the principles that animate, say, The Wire. How are those principles implemented on a daily basis? How does The Wire raise its money? How does it spend its money? So there needs to be a much greater degree of transparency as far as the operational, day-to-day. I'm not saying that we need to put a camera on for our editorial meetings. No, but readers and viewers need to have a sense of the big picture. How do we decide what we cover? How do we decide how we cover something? How do we deal with problems when they come up? How do we raise money? How do we spend money? I think that the more and more information that you can share, and that too on an ongoing basis with readers and viewers, the greater is the degree of trust. And the greater is the degree of trust, the greater will be the willingness of media of readers and viewers to actually pay for the work that you do. So we see the JTI initiative as a very useful kind of approach to creating transparency in a way that is not just a self-proclaimed attribute, but something that is verifiable or auditable, right? So the JTI yardsticks, for example, we are very confident that by adhering to these principles and having them audited by an external agency, right, and certified, will go a long way towards cementing that relationship of trust that we already have to a high degree with our readers and viewers. And I think that more and more media organizations around the world need to look very seriously at this, because, as I said, the fight against untrustworthy or fake news is not just a question of putting out good stories or refuting things that are fake, but in pioneering a new way of actually working. Because good journalism is the product of robust editorial and institutional practices, and what those practices are needs to be out there. People need to be able to see that. People need to be able to hold you to account. Like one of the big initiatives that we took early on in the life of The Wire was to create the post of an ombudsperson, a public editor, and her role is to stand outside the editorial pyramid. So she's not, answerable to any editor, but her role is to essentially, look critically at what we publish and serve as a platform for readers to write in with complaints or suggestions, and then for her to engage in a conversation with us about those suggestions or complaints, and then finally take a call, which is then binding on us, right? So I think that this concept of a public editor, the Guardian newspaper has it. I think Asahi Shimbun in Japan pioneered the concept in the 1920s. This is one important element, but it's not the only element.
Certainly. And speaking of viewers and readership feedback, obviously there's also a possibility on the various online channels to ask questions, so please do use that option and we'll take them in just a few minutes. Now, time's running out fast. I'm really curious to get into an important subject, a global issue right now, which is that of digital surveillance, of increasing possibilities of states to know what you're up to know way before you publish, whom you talk to, where you talk to whom, and which subjects you're covering. You yourself have been a target. You've both been on the reporting side, part of the global media cooperation that published the Pegasus project this summer, but you've also been a target together with a number of colleagues, and you're part of a group of plaintiffs that with RSF is suing against the illegal surveillance of yourself. How did you first learn about yourself being affected? How did that change something? Was that a surprise?
So my colleague M.K. Venu and I were approached by Forbidden Stories sometime in March this year with the information that they suspected our phone numbers had been compromised with Pegasus, and would we be willing to have our devices forensically examined by Amnesty, and we consented to that. And the results came out positive. You always work as a journalist, particularly in the kind of dangerous terrain that we are in, with the assumption that governments are going to be subjecting you to surveillance. And many of us use the kind of standard precautions that journalists tend to use, which is to increasingly use encrypted messaging as opposed to SMS and so on and so forth. But we didn't imagine, or we didn't think that Pegasus would be used, that the government would go so far as to use a tool that is allegedly meant for dealing with terrorists and other sort of criminals, use that against journalists. So it was shocking, and it was an eye-opener. And of course, The Wire then joined the Pegasus project, and we examined. There were more than 1,000 odd numbers from India that had been that were on this database of probable surveillance or Pegasus targets, and we did the work for that over a few months and uncovered the fact that many journalists had been targeted, opposition politicians, human rights defenders, lawyers, even people, registrars of the Supreme Court, a former election commissioner of India, very, very wide-ranging set of targets. And we then, essentially ran these stories. And after we ran them, we were besieged with requests from people who felt that they were vulnerable and who wanted their phones checked and so on and so forth. And the question inevitably that everybody asks is, what can we do to safeguard ourselves? And the answer that we gave them was that, look, at the end of the day, there's not much that can be done, because even if you cleanse your particular device, there's no telling how easily the government can then reinfect you either with Pegasus or something similar. So maybe some lifestyle changes are needed. Maybe we should rely less on phone communication, particularly when things are sensitive. But my advice to all journalists who ask me this question was that you can't allow Pegasus and the fear of surveillance to come in the way of your work. So yes, it's wise to assume that you are the target of surveillance. Yes, you should be using sensible precautions. And for things that are particularly sensitive or confidential, maybe have in-person meetings where you keep your phones away. But you cannot allow the fear of surveillance to prevent you from doing sensitive stories, right? And that's the important lesson or takeaway that we drilled into everybody who spoke to us at that time, that you can't stop the work that you're doing. But yeah, I mean, the problem with using Pegasus against a reporter is not it's not that journalists do work that's in the public domain, but the timing is up to us, right? And so you report a story when it's ready. You report a story when it's complete in every respect. And you do not want the government to know in advance who your sources are or even later, you don't want them to know who your sources are. So these are all questions that need to be resolved and precautions have to be taken. You live and you are wiser now as to how to work in a more secure environment, but the work has to carry on.
What has the fallout been like in Delhi, politically, judicially?
The fallout has been dramatic. I mean, I think of all the countries where the Pegasus project reported on, India is the one country where the impact, to my mind, has been the maximum, because the Indian government is a democratically elected government, and I think the only other democracy that figured in the Pegasus project was Mexico. And Mexico, the Mexican government that used Pegasus was the earlier one. So the current incumbent was a target as an opposition candidate. But in India, it was a sitting, serving government that had been caught using Pegasus, right? So this was a dramatic, this was a slap in the face of people who believe in a level electoral playing field and the constitutional rights and so on. And I think the Supreme Court of India, for that reason, recognized the gravity of this set of allegations. And when people moved the court to demand an independent inquiry, because the government from day one denied the veracity of these allegations, but the court finally went ahead and has appointed an independent committee under the supervision of a retired Supreme Court judge. And more importantly, the Supreme Court disregarded the official plea that to investigate whether Pegasus was used or not would compromise national security. And the court said that national security cannot be an alibi for the violation of privacy rights of citizens and for violating the rights of media persons to protecting the confidentiality of their sources. So I think it was very far-sighted for the Supreme Court to say that Pegasus, when it's used against journalists, represents a very particular assault on media freedom. So it goes beyond privacy rights. You are actually attacking freedom of the press, and in particular, the right of a journalist to keep her sources confidential. And I think it's dramatic and significant for the court to have said that. And we are very hopeful that the committee that the court has appointed will do its work in the stipulated time frame and actually extract from the government the kind of information that the Supreme Court, the petitioners in the Supreme Court have demanded, which is tell us whether you've used Pegasus or not, what's the legal basis on which you targeted these individuals, show us the paperwork, show us the people who sanctioned this kind of intrusive surveillance, and then let the court decide whether this was legal or not.
What would you ultimately hope for?
Well, ultimately, I think heads ought to roll. I think there has to be accountability because you cannot violate the law of the land. India has very strict laws against hacking, for example, and Pegasus can only be inserted on your phone by hacking. And unlike, say, the US, maybe even Germany, there is no carve-out in the hacking law for the government to hack people's phones using national security. They could have drafted a law to include that, but they never did. So hacking is a crime. And, among the victims was a young woman who had alleged sexual harassment at the hands of a serving Chief Justice of India. Now, why was she targeted? This is a grave assault on the rights of a complainant in a serious matter. So surely the person who authorized her phone to be targeted, or the phone of opposition leaders, or the phone of journalists, somebody has to be held accountable for that. Because in a democracy, you cannot be allowed to get away with using public money to spy on people in this fashion and try to subvert elections, because opposition leaders were spied on in the midst of election campaigns, or subvert the legal case of a young woman fighting sexual harassment, or undermine journalistic freedom. So I think heads have to roll. Somebody has to pay the price.
Certainly. What I found particularly interesting, actually, was that as part of its wider judgment and statements, the Supreme Court also explicitly made reference to the chilling effect on the wider citizenry. So going beyond the direct targets of Pegasus, targeting really the freedom to speak up, to address grievances through the media, and the wider impact on freedom of expression. Do you see this as a...
Quite right. I think going well beyond the Pegasus issue. And, frankly, even if at the end of the day the government stonewalls this committee, which I hope that they're not successfully able to do, and that the court will step in. But what the court has said in terms of national security versus fundamental rights, and the impact of surveillance, particularly of this unregulated Wild West kind, on the citizenry at large, I think is very, very significant. The first line of defense when we published our allegations was for the government to say, well, no, whatever we do is done lawfully and legally. And then the second line of defense was, of course, this wasn't done explicitly by ministers, but the troll army of the BJP would then, say, well, what's wrong if 200 people or 300 people are subjected to surveillance? How does this concern, millions and millions of Indians? And the court has said, no, it concerns everybody, because the fact that you have the government illegally taking this kind of information from your phone, and don't forget, phones are now pretty much an extension of our bodies, right? We carry them everywhere. Pegasus allows the microphone and camera to be switched on at will, and for the information to be transmitted to the government. And the court rightfully said that this is something which represents a deep assault on the fundamental rights of millions of citizens. And they use the phrase, you're quite right, chilling effect, that if people are then going to watch what they say and watch what they write and trim their sails, maybe not speak freely, maybe even change the way they're going to vote. Who knows? If you start to fear that nothing you do is private anymore, and if you also see that this is a government that is quite happy to use the police and its various investigative agencies against critics, then the chilling effect is manifest. And I think it's significant that the court said this, and some of the passages in that order, I think, will serve to help defend the fundamental rights of citizens years and decades from now. I think this judgment will be cited as a benchmark for the fact that it rejects the national security primacy argument, in the face of fundamental rights of citizens.
Thank you so much. And I'd like to go to the audience. I'm sure there are a few questions. My colleague will read them out, I believe.
Yeah, we do have a few questions in the chat. And one of them, as a newspaper reader, or so to say, news consumer in India, how can I support investigative journalists or journalism apart from paying news outlets such as The Wire? Like, what can readers do? What can people who are interested do?
That's a great question. I think that the first step, of course, and you said apart from paying, I think it's important that readers financially back and support media organizations. But apart from this, I think in this era of information technology, and I think everybody out should serve as the eyes and ears of citizens as a whole. People should, I think, be vigilant about information that you come across. Engage in communication with your favorite media outlets so that you can pass on information or tips. We receive a lot of information and tips from readers that, of course, need to be verified and vetted. Not everything can become a story. Not every bit of information is true either. But I think that the role of the reader is not just confined to paying, but I think serving as a conduit for information, also sharing stories that have been published. I think that these sorts of interventions and supports, forms of support would be very, very useful.
Okay, thank you. And it is kind of also branching on the topic of activism. Like, what is your opinion of activist reporters who also, like, who are not neutral in the sense, but maybe also feel the need to intervene? And if they do, like, do they represent still journalists? Is that, like, do you see a boundary there, or do the interventions that they do kind of worsen the cases of police harassment?
Yeah. No, that's a great question. I think, and I don't know if my answer will make me unpopular or dissatisfy people, but you know, activists are not reporters, and reporters are not activists. I think that the job of a reporter is to go out there, get information, analyze it, speak to everybody concerned, and file as objective and honest an account as possible. The reporter may have her views, but an honest, objective report, an honest, objective reporter should be capable of filing a story which may even go against views and beliefs that she has in certain cases. Like you could be, I know many environmental reporters, for example, who are passionate about climate change, who are passionate about the environment, and that's a good thing. And we all have our views. So I'm not saying that reporters, to be an independent reporter doesn't mean that you don't have views. We all have views, we all have political opinions and so on, but the trick is to keep it separate from reporting, right? So the danger with having an activist approach to reporting is that you then go into a story with a preconceived idea. And and this is a major occupational hazard. I would say particularly when it comes to environment, particularly comes to lots of other issues where you get information and you get attracted to the story because the information suggests that there is a major violation happening or something of this kind, and then when you dig and dig and dig and you find that, well, maybe the story isn't quite what it appears to be, then you need to be able to report it accurately, right? So I think that it's essential for reporters not to look at themselves as activists, and for activists not to have expectations from reporters that they would have from other activists. So and I've seen lots of activists, just like government press releases overstate a case, right? So activist press releases also overstate a case, and it's our job as reporters to frankly treat information brought to you by government or a company or an activist with the same degree of critical scrutiny. And so, yeah, I mean, I think that reporters should not be activists, except when it comes to media freedom and freedom, like I make it a rule, for example, never to sign, I don't sign petitions on, the usual issues that people bring. Even though if I was a university teacher, I might sign those. Because I feel that as a reporter, if my platform is covering these issues, I can't be involved in signing a petition on that. The only exception I make is for when it comes to freedom of the press issues. So when it comes to attacks on reporters, arrests of reporters, and so on, I think some degree of activism is needed, because if the media doesn't speak out for media rights, then perhaps nobody else will. But that's the only exception I make. And even there, I would say that we encourage as a group, before we plunge into taking a particular view, we would be careful to ascertain what the facts are, and and then pick up and write on a cause in that way. So I think that even when in this limited arena of media freedom, if one occasionally slips into activist mode, that still does not free us of the obligation of being scrupulous when it comes to the factual basis of whatever we say.
All right, thank you.
Thank you. Do we have any more questions from the audience? Live in here? All right, then it leaves it to me to maybe ask about one last question about the big trends. What do you foresee? are you optimistic somewhat? We've now spoken, I think, about a great range of challenges that have worsened over the past few years. But we've also seen sort of a hint of optimism, certainly, for example, in the way that readers support you, in the way that independent news platforms have found ways to deal with these challenges, in the way that the Supreme Court certainly upholds some basic rights and basic democratic principles and procedures in the separation of power. So if you'd have to look at the next 5 to 10 years, are you optimistic overall? Where do you see the main challenges ahead?
I think that there are going to be enormous challenges because as we began our conversation by noting that there's been a qualitative escalation and a quantitative escalation in the assault on media rights over the last 7 years, the closer we get to India's next general election, which is in 2024, the more difficult the terrain is going to be because if the ruling party has attacked freedom of the press as a means of strengthening itself politically, then it's going to do more of that. So I think the terrain is going to be more hostile. We know the government has new rules and regulations in the pipeline that it would very much like to implement in order to cripple digital media. But I think there's a greater willingness on the part of readers and viewers to be vocal and to support media that they believe is doing a good job. And I see greater coherence within the digital media ecosystem. We recently helped to found, along with other media platforms, an industry body called DigiPub, DigiPub Foundation, which is a non-profit foundation that will represent the interests of digital media platforms. And I think this is a very positive step. We've created a kind of platform where readers, and this is again goes back to what we were talking about, the JTI. So the Wire has an internal ombudsperson, but we've created a second layer now through DigiPub Foundation for readers to turn to if they want, if they believe that their question or query or grievance has not been addressed by the Wire's independent ombudsperson. So I think that these are all mechanisms that are very positive. It shows a greater willingness on the part of digital media platforms to create rules for themselves and to stick to them. And I think that this combination of more responsible journalism on the one hand and the reader/viewer/citizens' willingness to support responsible independent journalism will provide us with the necessary heft to deal with the difficulty that we envisage is going to come over the next 2-3 years.
Siddharth, it's been a joy. Thank you so much for the many insights.
Thank you.
And thank you to our audience. All the best. Take care.
Thank you.
Good evening.